Good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa.
I'm Holly. I'm John.
Holly, what have you brought with you today?
I've got two of my rainbow turtles.
And can you tell us how they are similar, Holly?
Because they both have blue eyes and they're the same size.
And what's different about them?
Because one's pink and one's orange.
Okay, very good. And John, what have you brought this morning?
I put my little green cards.
You're like them a queen card. Can you hold up a bit higher?
And
how are they the same?
Because they both have eyes and they both have wheels.
They do, and they're both cars, aren't they? And what's different about them, John?
One's red and one's blue.
One's red and one's blue. Well, last week, boys and girls, if you were watching the church service, you would have seen Tagley, and he was telling us a little bit about King Saul and King David. And remember, he made the two different cups of tea. One was with hot water and one was with cold water. Well, this week, we're going to be looking a little bit more about King David and how he is similar to Jesus, but also how he is massively different to Jesus. So, Holly and John, do you know anything about King David?
He fought Goliath.
He did fight Goliath and he won. So let's watch this video and find out a little bit more.
The Miracle of Mercy. David and Saul. This is David. Hey! David was a shepherd who lived in Israel. David was chosen by God to be the next king of Israel when he was just a boy. But David had to wait a very long time until that promise would come true because there was another king of Israel named Saul. Saul was strong and tall and looked like everything a king should be. But Saul did not follow God like he was supposed to, and for that reason, God chose to take the kingdom from Saul's family and give it to David's. David became a great warrior. And everyone in the kingdom loved David. This made Saul jealous, and Saul hated David because he thought he would try to kill him and take the throne from his family. So Saul wanted to kill David. Whoa! Saul hunted David, but he couldn't catch him. One day, Saul heard that David was in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul gathered 3,000 of his skilled fighters and went to find and kill David. During Saul's search for David, he went in a cave to relieve himself. Well, this very cave was the one where David and his men were hiding. And when David's men saw that Saul was unaware that David was there and unable to defend himself, they said, "Now's your chance, David. This is God telling you that he will give you your enemy to do with as you wish." So David crept forward and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. But then David began to think that it was not right for him to take Saul's life. For no matter how much hardship and difficulty Saul had caused him, it was still not right for him to hurt the one who God had placed over Israel. So David told his men to back off, and he did not let them kill King Saul. They waited until after Saul had left the cave. And then David ran out of the cave and shouted after Saul, "My king! Why do you listen to people who say I am trying to harm you? Look, I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. This proves that I am not trying to harm you and that I have not sinned against you, even though you've been hunting me." David went on to promise that he would never harm Saul. David said that God would be the one to protect David and to rescue him from Saul's power. Saul said, "Is that really you, David?" And he began to cry. Saul said, "You are a better man than I. You have been amazingly kind to me today, for when God put me in a place where you could have killed me, you didn't do it. Who else would have done this? And now I realize that you are surely going to be king, and the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule. But promise me that when that happens, you will not kill my family." So David promised that he would not hurt Saul's family, and they left each other in peace. Now Saul continued to cause difficulty in David's life. But David kept his promise, and in time, David did become king of Israel. David was dearly loved by God, and Israel did flourish under his rule because David did everything that God wanted him to do, and he was a man after God's own heart.
Who was David? David was a shepherd. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, and it was his job to protect, guide, and feed his father's sheep.
Throughout his entire life, David loved God deeply and passionately. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, God describes David as a man after his own heart.
David was courageous and strong in battle. He defeated the surrounding enemies of Israel and brought peace to Israel's borders. He trusted in God for protection. He remained loyal to King Saul despite Saul's crazy pursuit.
David is considered Israel's most famous king. David understood that even though he carried the title king, he was merely a representative of the true King of Israel, God.
Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the city of David, to fulfill the promise God made to David.
David was a shepherd, and in Psalm 23, Jesus is described as a shepherd. The Lord Jesus leads, protects, and guides his sheep, us.
Both David and Jesus loved God. David was a man after God's own heart, and Jesus was God's heart.
Just as David was brave when he defeated his enemies, Jesus was incredibly brave to allow his enemies to cause him so much pain on the cross.
David and Jesus are both kings.
Although there are a lot of similarities between David and Jesus, we must remember that David was a sinner just like us. Yes, he was a good earthly king, but he made mistakes just like us. Jesus is sinless and is our heavenly king. Jesus is the only one who can save us from our sin. He is the ultimate king, the one who died and rose again for us.
He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. His name is Jesus.
Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and He holds us in His hand. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God. Our God is a great big God, and He holds us in His hand. He is higher than a skyscraper, and He's deeper than a submarine. He is wider than the universe and beyond my wildest dreams. And He's known me and He's loved me since before the